considered as one of the greatest leaps to the third dimension, the Metroid Prime series, building a legacy and pushing a once dormant Nintendo series into one of Nintendo's most beloved franchise with a dedicated fan base. But the creation of this series wasn't easy to achieve, with a deep history in the creation of an entire company, being an entirely different game at the beginning, and several major shakeups during development. This as such produced a great deal of content that never saw the light of day, including numerous boss fights, abilities, designs of Samus, and even entirely cut games to name a few. And so today on this special episode, we shall explore the entire history and beta unused content of the Metroid Prime series. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button and hit the like button too to further support us and keep creating new videos. 1998, an era where gaming was at a major high point, a year with tons of major releases including The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, Banjo-Kazooie, Metal Gear Solid, Resident Evil 2, and Final Fantasy VIII. But during that same year, a major change was brewing behind the scenes at Nintendo. With plans already underway to make a next-gen 128-bit console, Nintendo wanted to step into the next generation with a more adult appearance, as a result of them facing much stiffer competition as of late in the form of the PlayStation 1, as it appealed to an older market. And so, in an alliance between Nintendo and Jeff Spangenberg, the founder of Iguana Entertainment, who developed the Turok series for Nintendo 64, they made Retro Studios, under the mission statement of making more adult-oriented content to complement Nintendo's catalog of IPs that mainly aimed towards children and teenagers at the time. And so, within the next 2 years, hiring sprang about, going from 4 people in 98, 25 in 99, and by 2000, they had 125 people. So the company divided up into 4 teams to make 4 projects to pitch to Nintendo. These included NFL Retro Football, an RPG named Raven Blade, a racer called Thunder Rally, and an untitled action-adventure game. Being still rather new, the work environment was chaotic and development was falling behind schedule. As such, Nintendo took notice and sent 3 major representatives to evaluate the progress at the company. These included the late Satoru Iwata, prior to being president, Shigeru Miyamoto, and Senior Director of Production at Nintendo of America, Tom Prada. Shigeru Miyamoto, of course, ended up personally evaluating each and every project with strong critique and writing them off without hesitation, except for the proposal for the mysterious untitled action-adventure game. The action-adventure game was pitched as a sci-fi shooter featuring 3 attractive women who would fight these bug-like aliens and a neo-Nazi villain as well. Miyamoto was impressed by this pitch and saw a lot of potential in them in creating a female-led sci-fi shooter that fought bug-like aliens, much like an already existing Nintendo IP. At that point, Miyamoto suggested that the company should, alongside this game, create a new entry to the Metroid series, a long-dormant Nintendo IP at that point. And so, shortly after, they obtained the approval to use the Metroid IP. With that, Retro Studios, while recommended to work on both the untitled action-adventure game and Metroid at the same time, decided to take all their resources and the very team of the sci-fi shooter and turn it into a full-time Metroid team. This move had a massive ripple effect throughout the company and eventually led to the cancellation of those other 3 games that they were making in order to put all their eggs into the one major Nintendo IP that they had landed, and thus began the development of a 3D Metroid as a third-person shooter. It didn't take long for Retro Studios to quickly put together an FMV's teaser for Space World 2000, where we finally saw Samus in her own 3D game at long last. Though despite it being FMV, it was still using real assets from development at that time, including a different looking Samus. This version of the Varia suit resembled her suit from Super Metroid, which left audiences impressed. In fact, Samus had a number of different designs during development. One design featured her with a more angular and aggressive look, featuring a thinner visor and a more athletic waist. Almost like the suit was formed around her entirely, which wasn't far off as these sketches did showcase how tightly against her body it was. But last, we move into 2001, where we finally get a proper trailer to the now titled Metroid Prime. Samus' design had changed here. The proportions were the bigger change here, of course, being a bit shorter and her shoulder pads now being a good deal larger, resembling the final one she had actually. As well, Samus' cannon looked different too. While it's hard to tell how it exactly looked here, we do have a render of this version of Samus, which showed her with a silver and rather simplistic arm cannon before we slowly got to the complicated one that we got today. In fact, while we never saw this version demoed, we have concept art of an older cannon that came after that and before the final one. This one even featured a charge meter, potentially to show the maximum extent of the charge beam. Now, going back to that render, other than the cannon, the armor has an odd look to it. It's rather rusted and scratched up. Not surprising, since it would have been after Metroid 1 where Samus barely escaped an explosion. But it definitely stands in contrast to Samus' final armor, which is quite shiny. In fact, this design evolved once more to add some blue containers to it. Eventually, the higher-ups decided that this design of Samus was no good, and ordered artist Gene Kohler to design a more clean and polished design for Samus. And so they started again from scratch, and as a result, we got the Samus that we know today. And in my personal opinion back then and even now, when I first saw the design, it was jaw-dropping how beautiful it looked. While these were the ever-changing designs of Samus, there was one more that existed that was found within the data of the game, and it's the beta version of the Phazon suit. As many of you remember, the Phazon suit has a black and red aesthetic to it. Here, it is literally the color of Phazon, cyan and navy, and there is actually a small hint of it in the old art too, for this Metroid Prime boss battle that featured this version of the suit. And an oddity is that there are two different morph ball designs for it that are found within the data. Potentially they were deciding which one to use for the suit before scrapping it altogether and using the one that we got today. It has been confirmed that it was removed for not feeling evil enough, and considering the plans for the sequel were to feature a dark Samus made from the Phazon suit, I can't imagine her running around in this color scheme. And one other cut design choice were these animations for Samus' face. Yes, the one that we see reflected off her visor sometimes. A total of 7 exist that are looking in different directions, 2 expressions, none of which were used of course. Now, as we mentioned earlier, before Metroid Prime was put into the perspective that we all love, it was in third person. Now, Metroid Prime didn't begin development going fully into the idea that it had to be in third person. In fact, it was an ongoing debate with the producer wanting first person. However, the team was dead set on wanting a third person game, and so the majority won. For the time being. And so development went on throughout 2000 while in third person. No real footage of it exists except this one screenshot of Samus in third person in the Chozo ruins. However, Shigeru Miyamoto returned again, ready to shake up the company to its core once more. This time, it was to change the game's perspective into first person, as he believed that third person wouldn't be very intuitive enough for the game. This led to the team having to go back and redo and rewrite large amounts of the game from scratch, essentially a near restart to production. And so in 2001 at Space World, they were able to finally get development back on track and presented their first look at Metroid Prime, now in first person, featuring Samus' beta canon at that. Now, while developing this game, the game had a lot of influence from Super Metroid, from Samus' earlier designs as mentioned, to enemies which we'll shortly get to, and even utilizing her 2D abilities in 3D. 2 of these abilities were however cut, but their scan image remains in the data. One of these is the famous Speed Booster ability, where when she runs for long enough, she'd gain extra speed and can smash through walls even. Metroid Prime of course didn't have any long hallways, so it was difficult to implement, therefore scrapped. The next one is the Spring Ball, where Samus as a morph ball could jump. This of course ended up returning in Metroid Prime 3, and the Trilogy pack of Metroid Prime also had it. Meaning this was probably cut rather late into development, as they probably didn't have enough time to finish it. Now, being the series' first entry into 3D, This was during an era where voice work was becoming more and more common, and so, with Metroid entering this era, they hired voice actress Jennifer Hale, most famous for her role as Naomi Hunter in Metal Gear Solid, as the first lady of gaming herself now. While she did all her grunts that we hear in the game, she didn't have any voice lines. However, this wasn't always the case. Deep within the data of the game, a voice monologue of hers exists that was set to play out at the start of the game to recap the story of Metroid 1. Have a listen.
10 years ago, below the surface of planet Zebes, the mercenaries known as space pirates were defeated by interstellar bounty hunter Samus Aran. Descending to the very core of the pirate stronghold, Samus exterminated the energy-based parasites called Metroids and defeated Mother Brain, the leader of the pirate horde. But the space pirates were far from finished. Several pirate research vessels were orbiting Zebes while Samus fought on the surface below. After the fall of Mother Brain, the ships escaped, with the hopes of finding enough resources to rebuild their forces and take their revenge. After discovering a possible pirate colony on planet Talon 4, Samus has again prepared for war, hoping to end the pirate threat forever.
And with how perfectly it's spaced out for this beginning too, it's clear what the intentions may have been. But I theorize that they might have cut this because Nintendo may have wished for her to remain silent. A far cry to what came down the road, of course. Now, as mentioned, Metroid Prime's development stemmed in taking a lot of inspiration from Super Metroid, and so one of the things they did was try to recreate a number of enemies from Super Metroid in 3D, according to 3D artist Mike Sneath. In fact, entire animations and AI were made around these old enemies too, but were told to scrap it by Nintendo themselves in favor of making new enemies. So what they did instead was to make a new enemy model that was different in design, but functioned similarly to what they had made. For example, the classic enemy, the Ripper, was replaced by the glider in the final game. Rippers were used in the classic games as a means to platform on. In other words, it would have been used to swing across like gliders in the final game. In fact, we even still got the model for the Ripper in the game. If one model swaps it with the glider, it functions perfectly. While models of other Super Metroid enemies don't exist, some of their names remain in the data that shows what they became. These include the enemy's Fire Flea, which became the Plasma Mite, and Metorid, which became the Shriek Bat. Now another cut enemy is the enemy Sovas. A concept art exists for him, and it appears that he was in the pre-release demo disc for the game in a containment tank, but was dead. It was, however, removed in the final game, but its scan data still is in the data, as well as the sound effects. Have a listen. However, it seems some of the chunks of his model are still accessible via the data of the Chozo ruins, which shows where he might have appeared actually. Now moving on to space pirates, much like the earlier enemies, they were also envisioned to look more like their Super Metroid design, as seen in these concept arts, having a more organic look and lacking armor while still having large claws. As well, another archetype of them was also supposed to exist that had biomechanical weapons directly attached to their bodies. Would have fit well with how they were modifying themselves heavily with Phazon. In fact, speaking of Phazon, remember that research lab in the Phendrana Drifts that had a tube with what looks to be chunks of whatever they were experimenting on? A scan of it in the game says the tank holds the remains of experiment 7526, conversion of elite pirate unsuccessful. Now what I like to present is this concept art, which is what this thing would have looked like that is in the tube if pieced together. Which if one does take these pieces out and snips them together, they make this odd monstrosity. According to a former Retro Studios developer, it was intended as a scrapped enemy of mutated space pirates from that failed experiment with Phazon. It even still has that giant claw from the classic space pirate design. Now we know on Talon 4, all the Chozo are dead thanks to the appearance of Phazon, and all you got are their ruins. But it appears that one might have been intended to survive, at least based on this concept art that we have. But why is this under the enemy category? Well, it's mainly because of this one animation, which shows a rather deranged and on-guard Chozo. Thus, it may have in fact tried to attack Samus if encountered. As well, remember the Chozo ghosts that will randomly attack you? Well, apparently a winged variant was also planned too, possibly giving it more versatility. Now, the concept of giant Metroids aren't new to the series. A few of them had you do endurance runs in fact in their final area against them. Well, they were also set to appear in Metroid Prime. We have a concept art that showcases them next to the final boss Metroid Prime, and they are absolutely massive. In fact, there were other Metroid designs also considered too in pre-production on the idea of making more mutated Metroids, and some of these designs are truly grotesque. Which in my personal opinion, I think it would have been an absolutely amazing addition if they were added. As well, the Omega Metroid from Metroid 2, and of course at that time Metroid Fusion, was also set to appear in the game too. Might have even had something to do with the connectivity feature between both the games. Now, while Metroid Prime had a ton of enemies that were cut, a large number of bosses were cut too actually, both classic and new. Going to the very beginning, in the 2001 Space Road trailer that was showcased earlier, we see Samus fighting the Parasite Queen, except she's not in a chamber like in the final game, having a very spider-like animation of going along walls and climbing ceilings even. Now, a rather fascinating boss fight that was cut is the Sheegoth Prime. This was supposed to be the third and final form of the Sheegoth species that was found in the Phendrana Drifts. It seems it made it quite late into development too, with its models and animations all built, as found on senior animator Derek Bonakowski's website. Based on the concept art, it would have been a massive beast as seen next to Samus. However, because of the enemy looking too much like an RPG villain as opposed to a Metroid one as stated by Nintendo, it was removed. So instead we got the Ice Golem Thardas as the boss of Phendara Drifts. Which brings us to Thardas himself, which while yes he did appear as the boss of Phendara Drifts, it was actually supposed to be the boss of Magmoor Caverns, an area of the game that actually lacked a boss. According to 3D artist Mike Sneath, the battle would have waged in a large lava pit arena. In fact, we have this animation showcase of Thardas from Bonakowski's website that depicts it with an orange core as opposed to the final blue core that it had in the final game, indicating how it would have appeared in Magmoor Caverns. Alas, the change was likely done as they wanted some form of a boss in Phendara Drifts, even if it meant leaving Magmoor Caverns without one. Now moving on to the next element, Forest, we got the boss Flagra, which was quite different in the beta stage. Originally, it was set to appear in a forest, and was supposed to hatch from a seed as shown by 3D artist Mike Sneath. This all contrasted heavily with the final games as he instead appears in the Chozo ruins instead of a forest. As well as vines were part of his body originally too, before being detached and becoming part of the level. Makes sense why this battle stage was cut, as full forest levels aren't very Metroid-like overall. Now another cut boss fight is this flying insect looking boss, looking to resemble a space pirate actually, or even similar to a flying pirate that appears in the final game, but it still has a lot of differences. In fact, while we have the model with its animations here, it in fact even has an earlier form as seen in this concept art that depicts it with a Metroid tied to its back. Potentially uses the Metroid to fly? But it's still up in the air as to whether he would have actually been a boss or not. It's definitely more advanced than your average flying pirate, but at the same time quite small for a boss considering it's next to a Metroid here. It's even possible that it might have been a mini-boss. Now let's get to the classic bosses that were to appear in the game. Most popular is Kraid. Yes, this massive beast that took up twice the screen size would have appeared, and we got two concept arts of him actually. The first of which is a more normal and familiar one, but adds a lot more than just 3 projectiles to his belly. Could have been quite a tough battle actually. But then we got the version that they wish to use, and it's this one, where he had a metal shell that replaced part of his head. It could have very well been the repaired mecha form, much like the way we have a mecha form for Ridley, considering this game does take place after Metroid 1, where they both were handily defeated. The idea would have been to climb to the top of rickety platforms and drop something on Kraid's metal head to damage him. The projectiles would have been back at 3 here, of course, unlike the threatening earlier concept art, and looks to have appeared in the Phazon mines based on the background, meaning he would have been the boss instead of Omega Pirate. Gene Kohler went on to mention that they were deep into development of this level, but ultimately due to time constraints, they couldn't polish it enough to make it good. As such, they cut him out altogether and provided Omega Pirate as the boss of the Phazon mines instead. Which might mean that Omega Pirate was an easier boss to create in comparison. And now we have the big bad Aurora herself, Mother Brain, planned to make her debut in full 3D. There is one major concept art of her, which has these eyeballs translucent throughout it. It may simply point to how Mother Brain looks over all operations of the Space Pirates, and we also got Samus right next to her here, which shows that Mother Brain might have been at her largest size yet. Of course, it never made it to actual development, as no actual model of her exists, so this was obviously cut early. To round out the bosses, let's talk about Ridley. Ridley had a number of different designs considered originally, everything from an almost entirely mechanical form to a more organic one with its ribcage poking out, maybe pointing to him still being injured from Metroid 1, and this insane looking orange and red form that even had a Samus-like cannon equipped to him. Imagine getting a fireball to the face while dodging laser blasts from his cannon there too. But there is one more curious piece of art for Ridley, and it's this peaceful looking art of him. It looks very Chozo-like in design, with Samus standing right in front of him, but with no provocation. It is theorized that maybe in the big battle with Ridley near the end, he'd get possessed by the Chozo ghost, which caused him to go into a metamorphosis to reflect his possession even. In fact, the art is literally called Dark Possessed Ridley, which adds a whole credence to this theory in fact. Could have been a very beautiful way to end the battle, to be honest. What comes after Ridley is the final area of the game, the Impact Crater. It's a very short section, which has a few platforms with some fission Metroids around, before facing the big bad Metroid Prime herself. However, the original plans for this were to make it a full-scale level, much like every other area in the game as seen in these various concept arts, showcasing an area that looked very different from anything in the game, with lava shooting out, strange plants or wildlife, and potentially the level itself being alive, with the door looking like it opened up in a rather organic manner if approached. The size of this original area would have in fact fit well with the giant Metroids I showcased earlier, as it'd be big enough for them to nicely fit there for Samus to combat. Another possibility might have been that time constraints may have led to the level being severely downscaled. Now, while we have delved into some audio, there are still some more things to discuss on this matter. Originally, the game's audio was being developed by Tommy Tallarico, who has an impressive list of Western games he's worked on. You may also recognize him from doing reviews on Electric Playground with Victor Lucas. Him and his studio were in charge of making all the sound effects for this game. This subsequently was done as the in-house audio team at Retro was quite busy with the other projects, including Raiden Blade, that was not yet cancelled. However, once those projects were dropped, this freed up the in-house team, and so Tommy Tallarico's services were not needed anymore. Even so, a large amount of audio was already produced and used in-game as confirmed by a correspondence between audio producer Scott Peterson and Tallarico himself, which states, "I am in the process of archiving all of our audio data and was hoping to get a little help from Tallarico Studios. Almost all the sounds your studio provided were utilized in some ways or another, and a few have really become signature elements to the game and to Samus herself. In fact, this very game led to Tallarico even being nominated for Outstanding Achievement in Sound Design. But even then, some of the audio still was not used altogether. What may have been cut is still a mystery. However, some audio was still found within the data. Whether they were made by Tallarico or the in-house team isn't confirmed, but these include some older versions of songs that have a slight difference and two key pieces of audio that are worth listening to. The first,
intense heat readings detected behind this door.
which normally in-game was shown in text form. I theorized that it was cut alongside Samus' monologue, which may be because they didn't want any voice dialogue in the game in the end. The second... This one clearly sounds like a charge beam, and in fact is labeled as Phazon Gun. Normally, the Phazon beam which you use in the final battle with Metroid Prime simply fires off without the ability to charge it. However, a sound effect exists here that may indicate that the plan was to let you charge it too, like any other beam. Now to bring this home, as many of you know, when you connect Metroid Fusion to Metroid Prime, it unlocks the Fusion Suit and a version of Metroid 1 that you can play. However, according to former Retro Studios developer, instead of Metroid 1, Super Metroid was planned to be the unlockable game. This was an obvious choice considering how much of development that we have gone over had oozed from the influence of Super Metroid, so it would have been the perfect choice. It was being helmed by programmer David Kirsch. Proof of concept even exists for it, as a scrapped UI selector was found on the artist Danny Richardson's website. However, Nintendo soon got a whiff of this, and since Kirsch was using a third-party emulator to achieve this, Nintendo ordered the removal of Super Metroid. And so we got Metroid 1 instead, using an in-house Nintendo-sanctioned emulator. And so in late 2002, Retro Studio completed the game and released Metroid Prime after an impressive 2 years of development. Metroid Prime was a huge critical and commercial success, having won numerous Game of the Year awards and did the astonishing feat of becoming the second best-selling game of November of 2012, just behind Grand Theft Auto Vice City. The game had successfully revived a dormant Nintendo franchise. The Nintendo subsidiary that developed the game, Retro Studio, had clearly proven their talent on their first ever completed game. Nintendo HQ being pleased with this asked Retro Studio to make a sequel. The series wasn't staying dormant any longer. But to make a sequel to what may be one of the best games of all time was a tall order, without it being seen as just the sequel. And so Retro Studios took on several pitches in order to select what was truly worthy as the follow-up. While to anyone who beat the original Metroid Prime and got 100% within it, the cutscene showed a dark hand rising from the remains of the final boss Metroid Prime, clearly pointing to something more indeed being planned even before launch, and Retro Studio was intending to fulfill that wish. During the end of Metroid Prime's development, Retro Studios felt confident that they'd likely be greenlit for a project and tasked level designer Tony Giovannini to write the direct sequel to Metroid Prime, with concept artist Andrew Jones assisting in visualizing it. This era is dubbed collectively as Metroid Prime 1.5. This story originally came to light in 2011 thanks to the online research of Mama Robotnik on the NeoGAF forums, who discovered it on Tony Giovannini's now defunct website. This scrap pitch is a 21-page document that details the story, gameplay, and whole variation of modes. Having read through this and thoroughly analyzed it, I've put together here a summarized presentation of what this scrap pitch was about, while visualizing it using the concept art in the pitch and also providing artistic renditions. This story takes place directly after Metroid Prime 1, when Samus navigates into space from Talon 4. While resting in her cryo chamber and the ship being on autopilot to get home, a distress signal comes from a massive alien vessel the size of several star destroyers. Suddenly, it pulls Samus' ship in via a tractor beam, trapping Samus within it while it folds into a parallel dimension. When Samus wakes up, this mystery vessel appears to have very little power running through it and appears thoroughly abandoned. The ship is roughly the size of the Chozo ruins and the Phazon mines combined, but far more compact as it's filled with different puzzles and areas to explore that one would be returning to over and over again during the course of the game. In fact, puzzle solving and multiple methods of navigation would have been the theme of this game. And this time, there would be a heavier reliance on the Morph Ball too, as fans found these sections incredibly fun in the original game. At the same time, since the ship did warp to a different dimension, The physics would alter in a variety of ways. This includes the gravity going out of control, Samus at times having to be on the ceiling instead, or the time in reverse, so that enemies start moving in reverse and water even moving backwards into a faucet. However, Samus soon discovers that there is an active AI running the ship, and it's gone mad. The ship is set on a collision course to a peaceful planet in order to enslave its inhabitants and strip it of its natural resources. But the AI isn't all that there is on the ship, as the ship has alien inhabitants in suspended animation that were being created to utilize in that invasion. As such, this time Samus has to deal with a variety of experimental life forms. Created by the AI, there are 3 life forms made from experiments done on alien races. The first is the Metroid, which is 6 foot tall and is half Metroid and half human hybrid. Yes, Samus wasn't the first such hybrid when she later becomes one in Metroid Fusion. It excels in stealth, sabotage, scouting, and long-distance kills. It also has a Metroid equipped to its chest that can detach mid-combat. Like any Metroid, it can latch onto Samus and absorb her strength to give the Metroid her abilities. If one of them is killed, the other dies too. Next is the Trash Hunter, which is an 8.5 foot tall hybrid of a space pirate and an unknown species. Having very chameleon features, it can even change to the tone to match to the surroundings and crawl on walls too, while using its sharp saber-like claws to fight. And lastly is the Shock Beast, standing at 10 foot tall. It is yet another hybrid of the space pirate and an unknown alien species. Being the main shock trooper used in the alien fleet, they carry high-powered pulse rifles and frag grenades, with the ability to self-destruct and low health. It has a genetic problem too, in that its heart and lungs are exposed, making its weak point rather obvious. A little fun fact is that this design was later reused as the basis of the space pirates in the final iteration of Metroid Prime 2. But aside from these life forms, Samus has far more common enemies she has to deal with too, and it's a variety of droids. These include simple security drones that patrol the hallway who call backup and can be seen via the X-ray visor. Slow and heavy worker droids that use numerous weapons including a flamethrower, jackhammer, and drills. Next is the Hunter droid, which are bipedal assassins that double at being acrobatic, from dropping from ceilings to running up walls while utilizing an electro blade. And lastly, there is the guard droid, which are heavy bots that hover around with cannons ready to fire at Samus, and require the use of the thermal visor to find their weakness. Now, the AI that was mentioned earlier serves as the main antagonist of the game, and it has 4 different personalities. It primarily tries to play a deadly game with Samus in this horrific landscape through numerous tricks and taunts Samus at every corner while controlling those robotic enemies. In many ways, it was like the HAL 9000 from 2001: A Space Odyssey. The AI's 4 personalities all can appear to Samus as either holograms or in a droid form too, while at the same time affecting the gameplay depending on who is in control. These include the Killer, who has the personality that is a lot like Hannibal Lecter from Silence of the Lambs.
A census taker once tried to test me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
During his sections, the gameplay and atmosphere feel akin to that of a horror film, and being a lot more combat heavy with enemy spawns. The horror theme of these would consist of strobing lights, thick fog, and even camera distortion. Another AI is the Child, who instead puts Samus through much heavier puzzle sections, and with the objective of just simply wanting to play with Samus. It, as the name suggests, talks and looks like a child too, while at the same time the environment would have a softer and warmer tone, the opposite of the Killer. The Mother, being another AI, is the core AI, and potentially the original AI at that, as she knows something is wrong with her but is unable to do much. She acts as well as the helper AI, rewarding Samus while also having a warm and motherly personality, a lot like the SAL 9000 from 2010: A Space Odyssey. Likely may have been very crucial to the main plot too. Lastly, there is the Martyr, the leader of the AI system, and the one trying to carry out its mission to enslave planets. having never failed, is dead set on completing its task. It has full control of the ship too, and all of its security system that Samus has to deal with. It would have appeared as a boss fight, where Samus may have had to destroy its main reactor to finish it off, all while having the personality that is a cross between MCP from Tron, Shodan from System Shock 1 and 2, and Colonel Kurtz from Apocalypse Now. To counter all these foes and puzzles, Samus would surprisingly still have all of her abilities from Metroid Prime 1 without losing them. Except the AI apparently would be disabling certain ones depending on the area she is in, thanks to a containment matrix that is set up all over the ship. Once Samus disables those in each area, she is free to use her abilities. But in addition to her moves from Metroid Prime 1, she also now has a few close combat techniques utilizing her arm cannon, now including the arm smash, which is Samus just smashing her cannon down on the head of an opponent or from side to side even. The elbow smash, using her elbow, she can strike in a diagonal upward motion or downward motion. The right hook. For those of you who play Samus Returns, you know this one, where she swings her arm cannon upwards. And the crash drill, a spin attack of some sorts that would attack all enemies around her and knock them back. This would definitely put it along the lines of shooters of that era that used their primary weapons as close-range attacks. However, Samus isn't alone on the ship, and a number of other bounty hunters have also been pulled into the ship too. And this was before both Metroid Prime hunters and Metroid Prime 3 introducing hunters into the mix, down to even how these hunters, including Samus, were brought to one place. So it's even possible that this scrapped idea did influence those ideas down the road. While designing the bounty hunters, the plan was for all of them to be rather unique and memorable in their own way, with each of them also having their own morph ball ability. Another idea was that they could even have been hired by the Galactic Federation to join Samus in exploring this vessel as a collaboration. This as such would lead to teamwork between the hunters and Samus in completing various objectives to stop the ship, destroy the AI, and destroy all life forms on the ship too. Therefore, a co-op gameplay was considered here too, where you would play in split screen with players controlling various hunters and would work together to solve puzzles, face enemies, split up and search, and make daring escapes. In fact, while venturing together, they would all have to use their unique abilities to advance. For example, when a morph ball hole is found next to a locked door, Samus would have to use the morph ball ability to get through that hole, get to the other side, and open the door to let the rest in. Alternatively, aside from the usage of the bounty hunters for co-op, at one point during the adventure, Samus would be able to go and collect parts to create a Mecha Samus that either can be controlled in her place or even have a second player take control to play the game in co-op. Additionally, boss fights would multiply in difficulty depending on how many players were in co-op during that time, such as having several weaknesses that would need to be exploited instead of just one. But now the question begs, why were Samus and the bounty hunters all pulled into this nightmare vessel? And it's simply because the AI want to assimilate their abilities in order to further perfect the aliens they were building. Throughout the story, Samus and the bounty hunters have all been able to access a power-up system in the ship, with drawbacks. While in previous Metroid games, Samus would simply get an upgrade, and that was that. Here, however, this is how the AI would have been able to assimilate the hunter's abilities into its data. When one accesses these machines, they are able to gain a variety of upgrades that includes cloaking, wall walking, ceiling hugging, camel skin, infrared vision, and even a self-destruct method. But every time a bounty hunter uses this machine, their genetic information is downloaded and is used to develop the alien breed that the AI is growing to have these very abilities. Therefore, as time passes, we would start seeing enemies with a number of Samus's abilities, including utilizing the morph ball and bomb skills in a terrifying manner. As such, it would lead to the player making a decision if they really need to use this machine to upgrade and get those abilities, or if they should just skip it. On the flip side, the other bounty hunters would also be able to access the genetic abilities of each other that were downloaded by the machine, as well as use it for themselves. Therefore, all the hunters would be able to have the morph ball ability by the end too. However, the assimilation was all done in a bid to culminate and boil down to build the game's final true boss, Dark Samus, or Evil Samus as the documentation states. taking in all of Samus's abilities, the AI would build their ultimate alien that would be a powerful clone of Samus to take on the real Samus at the very end of the game. Now, as we remember at the end of Metroid Prime 1, it was shown that Dark Samus was being created from the final boss Metroid Prime's remains, regenerating into it. If this new evil Samus was being made by this AI, it would have been, in fact, a totally different character from the Dark Samus that we know. This might have ended up like the case where we have both a Metal Sonic and a Mecha Sonic in the Sonic the Hedgehog series, but yet, both are rather distinct from each other. In other words, the Dark Samus that was made from Metroid Prime would have been planned to use later in the series if this happened. But as the story progresses, the ship gets near the planet, and eventually folds back into this dimension and begins its assault on the planet with the alien race it's created. While it is unknown if this means that the battle against evil Samus would be on the planet upon landing there, it would be interesting to see how Samus and the gang would have ended the ship's all-out invasion in the very end. And this closes off the main campaign. However, unlike anything seen in the series up to that point, several multiplayer modes were planned for this too, very in-depth ones at that as well. These modes include Arena Deathmatch, which many of you are familiar with from games like GoldenEye and Halo, Team Arena Deathmatch, which would be like the above, but with teams, a lot like Halo again. Capture the Metroid, kinda like Capture the Flag, except with a Metroid that the two teams fight in order to capture in a containment unit and bring it back to their team ship. However, that containment unit has a time limit and is fragile. If damaged, it explodes on the player and their surroundings. Next is the Ancient Chozo Robot Battle. This fun little mode would be an arena battle mode where you'd boost up into the chestplate of these giant robots that are probably of Chozo origin based on the name, and can then beat up each other in a physical brawl. Base destruction. Think kinda like Counter-Strike, where one side goes to blow up hot points on the enemy's base with a timed detonator. Except both sides do this in this game. 3-on-1. One player is the Omega Pirate. Yes, these beasts from Metroid Prime 1. While the other players are the bounty hunters trying to fight it. Morphball Bumper Car Super Battle Gaiden. A mouthful, but it's apparently a combination of bumper cars and Marble Madness. Except much more violent, where everyone is a Morphball, attacking each other and bumping into each other too. No power bombs allowed apparently. And it seems online play was something that they were considering to use too for these modes, based on the description of Team Arena Deathmatch, which if this did happen, it would have been the 6th officially supported online game on the GameCube. In addition, there were some mission-based multiplayer modes too that also could be played in single player. One of them is called Extract the Criminal, which gives a look at Samus being an everyday bounty hunter, having to capture a dangerous criminal, either dead or alive. The example given in the documentation showcases a spaceport with a nightclub as its setting. The catch is, however, that this mission was meant to be done in stealth, as the target had a ton of bodyguards nearby, and was supposed to feel one part like Metal Gear Solid, one part like Boba Fett, and one part like Hong Kong cinema. This nightclub level would have been 3 floors tall and have a variety of rooms in it. As well, a pipe system also existed between floors, which Samus could use to roll in as a Morphball, as an attempt to get close to the target in secrecy and capture them. Stealth is also the only method too, as a means to avoid casualties, and the use of the X-ray visor must have been used too in order to identify the criminal's true identity. Now that is a single player mission. The multiplayer ones aren't as in-depth, and more minigame based in fact. These include Riot Squad. Inside and outside of that same nightclub, a riot is taking place, and 4 bounty hunters would have to take out these rioters. The winner being the one with the most kills. Control Point. A lot like a simple deathmatch, except there are control points one goes up to and scans to get points and keep control of. The one with the most points is titled the Bounty Hunter. Protect the Celebrity, a team-based multiplayer mode that features 4 bounty hunters protecting and escorting a controversial android pop star to their ship, who apparently has been getting death threats from their maniacal fanbase. Object Race, taking place once again in the nightclub level. 4 bounty hunters race through while collecting treasure along the way. No killing, but any weapon procured can be used to knock back a player, freeze them, or even get objects off their hand. And lastly is Bottle Blast. A simple game of bottles lined up at a bar, and each bounty hunter can use any weapon to destroy these bottles. The one with the most destroyed bottles wins. While all of this is a well put together and thought out pitch, the pitch concludes that they aim to complete this game in only 1 year. For comparison, Metroid Prime 1 had a development cycle of 2 years, so this would be a rather tall order. But the catch is that this was going to be a smaller adventure. As explained earlier, the ship was the size of only 2 areas from the original Metroid Prime, but far more compact with different puzzles and areas to explore that one would return to over and over again to explore areas within the rooms that were once unreachable. At the same time, it would still be using the same engine of the original Metroid Prime. Therefore, by saving space on building an engine and densely packing areas, it would have saved a lot of development time. In many ways, it would have been a lot like what The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask was to Ocarina of Time, except this time to Metroid Prime 1. But as we can see in the end, this was a wildly different story from Metroid Prime 2's actual story. So then this brings us to the elephant in the room. What happened? Why was this scrapped? Looked to be a cheaper game to make, while at the same time looking like a worthy sequel. While no official reason has ever been given, a few reasons can be theorized. The first is that this may have in fact been just one of many pitches made to Nintendo that were rejected. In fact, another pitch did exist too that took inspiration from the movie Memento, where the protagonists suffer from anterograde amnesia, where one can't remember anything past a certain traumatic event. Which would have been a very dark theme in itself if Samus suffered from amnesia the whole game. Might even have been how she would have lost her weapons this time too. But considering both Metroid Prime 1.5 and this Memento pitch are rather dark stories that are very different from Metroid's normal sci-fi stories, it might have been rejected just for being too different. Having a more horror and mechanical theme going through it, while the feeling of isolation being more or less completely gone thanks to the inclusion of bounty hunters and the co-op mode, and a story that feels rather far removed from much of the Metroid mythos, save for experimentation done on Metroids and space pirates by a killer AI, while at the same time this entire story that may or may not have been inspired by popular R-rated horror films. Alternatively, another reason it may have been rejected was that it was a smaller adventure. Since this was a series that was freshly revived with massive success, taking a drastic change from the first game might have been a bit too risky for them. Complaints might have came in that said that the game just doesn't stack to the near length and quality of the first game, and thus seen as just the sequel. But whatever the reason was, this had to be scrapped, and so Retro Studio had to start again from the drawing board. With the first major pitch now rejected, Retro Studios wished to go in a different direction. The idea was a story about the conflict between light and dark. A simple idea that previous Nintendo games have explored. But their intention was to make a story that everyone could understand. Light and dark. Possibly, this idea of making a simpler story may in fact be the very reason why the original pitch was rejected due to its complex story. As senior designer Mike Wicken put it, "We wanted a push and pull. The whole game is pushing and pulling you back and forth between the dark and light." It ended up being that we wanted something that could feed into that dichotomy, that conflict between the two, and how the player's basic abilities reflect that. In other words, even going beyond the story, the whole game was to have that feeling of contrast, whether it be your weapons, the enemies, and even the world. And as mentioned prior, this was familiar ground for Nintendo, as previous games such as The Legend of Zelda A Link to the Past had done this. In fact, they even sought advice from an unnamed developer of A Link to the Past on incorporating the ideas into the game. As such, much like that game, the concept of a light and dark world that Samus would travel between became the focus of the game. In fact, unlike the first pitch, which had the idea of reusing features, models, and even the whole engine from the first game, this new approach virtually used nothing from the first game, a clean slate for what was to be the true follow-up to Metroid Prime. However, the only things they did want to return were ideas that were cut from the original game due to time constraints, such as the screw attack and kick jump ability. And to keep to the idea of light and dark, even the music was set to reflect that. With the return of Metroid musician Kenji Yamamoto, his focus was making both a regular theme that would reflect the areas of light aether and a dark variation for the same areas in dark aether. To top that off, the idea this time was to make a tougher game too, now that the audience was already used to the first game's controls and gameplay. And again, more unique boss fights to the point where, even in the final days of development, producer Kensuke Tanabe requested for 2 of the bosses to have an uptick in difficulty. However, even though that first pitch was scrapped, several ideas were still kept for the final game, with many being a natural fit to the theme of light and dark. Starting off and going in order, in the original pitch, you had hostile aliens that were suspended in animation, which now it was reinterpreted into the friendly Luminoth, who were also in stasis. The original pitch also mentioned traveling to another dimension where the physics and world were different. This idea could have stemmed into the idea of traveling between the light and the dark world. Now, when it comes to enemies, a few did survive into Metroid Prime 2's story. Normally in Metroid Prime, you never see many androids or robots that Samus has to tackle, and almost everything is organic. The original pitch was the first to make common enemies of an army of droids, and just so it happens, it even made it into the final game with the Sanctuary Fortress area, where Samus faces a numerous amount of them. In the original pitch, the AI was making organic creatures by merging different species together. One of them was the Shock Beast, which was 1/2 space pirate and 1/2 something else. However, despite the pitch being scrapped, the exact design was kept for the final game and was used as the design for the space pirate trooper. Though it seems that the weakness, which was its exposed heart, was now removed. But the biggest inspiration from the original pitch was the idea of an evil Samus that became Dark Samus in the final game. Now it's pretty clear from the ending of Metroid Prime 1 that they wanted some evil humanoid to fight Samus in a sequel. In fact, it was the developer's desire to have Samus fight a boss that was more her size in contrast to Metroid Prime 1's bosses, which were all huge. The inspiration for that idea came from Samus fighting SAX in Metroid Fusion, and they wanted as such their own version for this game. With the theme of light and dark now being the main approach, Dark Samus fit more than ever into the idea, and thus became the central figure of this new story. Now the design of Dark Samus changed numerous times during development, the 2 earliest being these 2 pieces of concept art, with this one being theorized to be the design that was to be used with this original pitch. Both look very different from the final Samus, the original pitch version being more in line with the design of the aliens on the ship, while also looking like a large amalgamation of other features. If this was indeed for the first pitch, it might reflect how it was made from copying abilities from Samus and also the other bounty hunters, leading to this warped design. Now, as for the other design, this one has a more sleek and more organic look, as well as looking a bit more simple at that, in many ways looking more like a humanoid shadow of Samus. But eventually, they moved past this idea and came to a more familiar but different territory. This one looking more like the Dark Samus we know, with a body that looks more like armor than flesh, though still with many differences, such as being jet black here and having a T-visor helmet. However, the obvious difference here is that Dark Samus looked as if it could phase out or phase in from a mass of bubbles. While we have seen the final Dark Samus zip across areas or even fade into a particle phase-on, maybe it originally would phase across as a mass of phase-on bubbles and also fade into bubbles upon defeat. Now the interesting part about this design is that it went as far as getting a model. It has slight differences, such as the visor being a straight T-shape, but otherwise is literally Samus' suit but colored black. The odd part is how, unlike the normal Dark Samus, who is very aggressive in all her actions, this Dark Samus is much more stealthy. With the inspiration from SAX, it is possible that at some point Samus was required to hide from it, and Dark Samus would slowly go around looking for her, much like SAX did in Fusion. Now, while this design looked to have evolved into the final Dark Samus we know, there was another that was of a similar design but a bit more organic as seen with this, and how it has flesh that stretches across. The more obvious points being its shoulder pads looking a lot like the membranes of a Metroid, which is fitting as Dark Samus was made from Metroid Prime's remains. In fact, this might even be inspired from another concept in the original pitch that had an organic enemy that was half human and half Metroid called the Humatroid, that had a Metroid right on its chest. And Dark Samus being both of a Metroid DNA and Samus's DNA would make it in reality a sort of a Humatroid like this too. And then there is this one additional art featuring an armored Dark Samus, which is somewhat a cross between Dark Samus and the top of a space pirate. Makes one wonder if they had the idea of Dark Samus even being affiliated with the space pirates at one point. And the other aspect they wished to bring was multiplayer to the game, which was sort of a carryover from the original pitch. While the original pitch had a very in-depth multiplayer mode with many modes and even online play, this had two very basic modes and was offline only. They were fun, believe me. I actually played this mode with the only other person at a time that I knew who played this game, but the priority was clearly single player mode this time, and on a much more heavier scale at that compared to the original pitch. Thus, multiplayer's grand features from the pitch just couldn't make it in. Now, aside from the carried over concepts, there were a number of cut features including existing enemies found via concept art and data mining the game. To begin, we have a couple of cut enemies including the Ice Mites. Given their appearance, they were likely to be the creepy crawlers in an ice region of the game, but since the game lacked an ice region, they were cut early. Next is this cut humanoid-looking enemy, looking like a close-range fighter, almost assassin-like in fact. The word Chozo does also appear on it, making one wonders if it has any ties to the Chozos here, or maybe it is in some ways a Chozo itself. Now, some enemy properties were changed or even went unused actually, the first of which is the enemy air thorns, which are these flying droids that you can only ever see while going through a morphball tunnel and therefore you cannot scan them. However, through a glitch that lets you clip out of the normal playable map, you can walk to that morphball tunnel and actually be able to scan the air thorns, and yes, they actually have a proper real scan that went unused as such. Going from one droid to another, we have the lost ability of the Resbit enemy. Normally, this enemy has a unique attack that would infect Samus's power suit with a temporary virus that shuts down her whole suit and reboots it for a few seconds, leaving Samus vulnerable. However, unused text exists listing something called the Resbit weapon virus, which would only disable Samus's weapon, and thus would be a lesser virus compared to the full system shutdown of the other one. Next up is the Lightbringers, a simple crawler enemy that lights up the path and disappears upon getting the space jump ability. Normally, they are unkillable. However, if you skip getting the space jump through glitches and return to the Lightbringers once you have all the beams, there are a number of unused behaviors you can witness. The Dark Beam will entangle and weaken them, while the Light Beam powers them up, and the Annihilator Beam outright destroys them, a feature that went unused. Now the big one is for the main antagonist of the game, Emperor Ing himself. Normally, in his concept art, you can see that he has these glowy parts on his legs that may or may not be eyes for added creepiness, but in the game, he doesn't have anything like that. However, it seems that at one point he indeed was going to have these glowy parts there, and this is because the damage collision is still there where it normally should be. If one uses the screw attack and hits where the glowy parts were going to be, it damages the boss. In other words, the boss fight was going to be more complex with the utilization of his leg weakness. Potentially you had to hit all these spots before the main weak spot appears. In fact, the scan data confirms this by stating it is now capable of shielding its vulnerable areas with energy barriers. Beams of opposite polarity can damage these barriers, however. Heavy damage to these barriers will cause them to drop, exposing the creature's weak spots. Target the weak spots to immobilize and damage the enemy. However, this fight is very different from the description. There are no barriers that protect these weak spots, and no weak spots to shoot at in order to immobilize the Emperor before hitting his main weak spot. Now, if we look at the concept art once more, the Emperor is absolutely massive next to Samus, much more so compared to the final game. So the intended design may have been a much larger Emperor, and thus the requirement may have been to knock down its legs in order to bring its head down to the floor, where Samus can't shoot him then. In addition to these, there's also text for unused enemies too. Some left over from Metroid Prime 1, such as the Chozo, Ghost, Glider, Reaper Vine, and Zoomer, but also some that were legitimately made for this game but cut. These include a set of dark enemies, including the Dark Pirate Arrow Trooper, Dark Shriek Bat, Dark Sporb, and Dark Triclops, which a normal Triclops enemy was also planned too, but cut ultimately. Next, the Chika 3, which would have been the third form of the Chika villains. Next are the Creatures of Light, including Kenobites, which may have been the organic version of the mechanical Mechanobite. Mini-Rees, also known as the Infant Shriek Bats, and Flogus, which would have been the normal version of the final game's Dark Flogus. Now moving from enemies to the weapons that kill enemies, there are a series of cut weapons actually found via data mining the game. The first three being 3 cut bombs, the Annihilator Bomb, Dark Bomb, and Light Bomb. Thankfully, text exists for these abilities. The Light Bomb would create a trap that would explode upon an enemy entering its detection radius, burning the enemy while also blinding and stunning dark creatures. The Dark Bomb would release tendrils that would entangle and hinder enemies, and the Annihilator Bomb would release a cloud of light and dark particles that would seek and hurt all enemies within its radius. Honestly, very impressive moves, but in the end, kinda pointless with how overkill they already were with the impressive list of weapons we already had. Now the next three are Charge Beam combos. These are Dark Shredder, Light Blast, and Imploder. While one might assume that these are charge combos in addition to the Dark Burst, Light Burst, and Sonic Boom, they are simply just old names for them, as I'll explain why in a bit. As well, the multiplayer mode had 3 attacks that were removed, but found via data mining the text. These include Absorb Attack, potentially a move that would siphon life, and a Dark and Light Shield, which may have protected one against the opposing beam. And in addition to Samus's beta weapons, there is also Samus's beta light suit. Normally, it has a very sleek and slim look to it, but originally, it was a rather bulky piece of armor that they were planning. It's even possible that this was actually an upgrade intended for the light suit. Now, during the development of the game, Nintendo offered people who registered enough games to their predecessor to Club Nintendo a Metroid Prime 2 demo disc, one that I personally owned through just that. It utilized 12 rooms from the game's early sections but mashed them up together and cut them down to tell the opening of the game, including from when Samus arrives to when defeating the Warring Ing in Dark Aether and then stepping into the light portal where the game ends. Being a version before launch, it is officially a prototype of the game, therefore, some neat beta content was found on it. One of which is a rather odd boost ball attack, which when Samus does lock onto the enemy, she flies right into them with a boost ball charge. Kinda like the way Sonic does it in 3D Sonic games actually. And remember those enemies I mentioned earlier that were found via leftover text? Well, a few more are actually found here, including the Ing Killer, which was a droid unit that would have protected the Luminoth Fortress from Ing, but now seeks to kill all living beings that come near it. As well, another of the Chika family is found, called the Chika Swimmer. Might in fact have just been the more finalized name for the Chika 3 that was mentioned earlier. And remember when I mentioned how the Dark Shredder, Light Blast, and Imploder are just beta names for the final Charge Beam combos? Well, this demo disc actually has a proper description for the Imploder ability, reading, "The Imploder is the Annihilator Charge combo. It sends a blast of entangled dark matter, which then implodes in a burst of white-hot light." While it does confirm it to be the official charge combo for the Annihilator Beam, its effect is different from the final games, which creates an effect similar to a shattered pane of glass. Now moving back to the main release disc of the game, there is one cut location found through data mining the text, called the Metroid Hive. This is the name of the location of the Metroid Queen from Metroid 2. In this case, it is possible that there were plans to have a larger presence of Metroids in the sequel, even featuring a Metroid Queen in some ways. Now the most impressive find comes in the form of concept art, depicting a rather different ending to Metroid Prime 2. Normally, the final boss is a very phased-on up Dark Samus, so high on Phazon that you see its real body that resembled the now revived Metroid Prime under its armor, all while fighting it under a time limit before Dark Aether is destroyed. When defeated, it fades away in a mass of Phazon particles. Samus escapes and everything is fine. The end. Well, this was definitely very different from the concept. Originally, they were going to go Colossal, like with many final bosses, by having Dark Samus construct a large battle armor, potentially made from Phazon and the energy from the collapsing Dark Aether, in order to fight Samus, even having the power to rip the ground and pull lava up. With Samus being as tiny as she is next to it, I wouldn't be surprised if one was to use the ground platforms on the lava to scale up to get to the Colossal Dark Samus and hit the actual Dark Samus in what appears to be its weakness, as there is no armor covering her actually. However, it appears a bad ending was even planned that might even tie into this boss fight, and all stems from this one piece of concept art that showcases a Dark Samus wearing a version of the light suit and escaping an exploding Aether using all the Phazon it had collected. The big question being, why does Dark Samus have the light suit? I mean, yeah, it can wear it cause it isn't actually a being of dark like the rest of Dark Aether are. Now, the obvious theory is that, much like Metroid Prime absorbing the Phazon suit in Metroid Prime 1 and becoming Dark Samus would do it again to a dying Samus, and thus now having a suit of light with strong Phazon capabilities. At the same time, we are seeing the regular Aether also blowing up here, which may also indicate that Dark Samus would have absorbed the energy from not just Dark Aether, but also of regular Aether too, and thus dooming both planets as it flies away. Honestly, what an amazing bad ending would have been too, if we had gotten it, that is. While all that had been planned as development went on, the game had a deadline of holiday of 2004, and 3 months before the deadline, only 30% of the game was completed. As such, some of which was mentioned earlier may have been cut just to meet this deadline, including yet another attempt at bringing a playable port of Super Metroid to be unlocked, but couldn't due to the deadline. Being close to launch, the game also was in a dangerous spot as it was being alongside another major shooter, Halo 2. The Halo series at this point had taken over the market as the go-to shooter on console. Metroid looked very niche next to it as all eyes were focused on Halo 2, which happened to be releasing prior to the game. At the same time, the next Grand Theft Auto game, San Andreas, was set to release in November of 2004, leading to very stiff competition for Metroid Prime 2. Being that Metroid Prime 2 by the casual eye would be more comparable to Halo, it may be possible to think that the marketing team decided to focus on Halo 2 only in capturing its audience, and it becomes obvious with their next move. At this point, a website was launched for Halo 2 in July of 2004 called I Love Bees. It was an alternate reality game that was in actuality a disguised viral marketing campaign to generate hype for Halo 2. It was first discovered via a hidden message in the Halo 2 trailer. This marketing proved very successful too, with how huge the viewership of the website was. To combat this, the marketing team of Metroid Prime 2 decided to do a similar approach as their competition, a disguised viral website to generate buzz for the game. They launched not just one, but 4 websites. The first was one called Channel 51, which spoke of conspiracy theories and the extraterrestrial. This site was supposedly operated by someone named Samantha Manus. Even back then, as a teenager, I realized right away how this was just an anagram for Samus. This site contained screenshots and videos from the game, but claimed that they were real footage of aliens. Next is the Athena Astronautics, which claimed to be an organization for space exploration and colonization. Unfortunately, we can't access the site anymore due to the lack of flash needed for it. But we have a screenshot of the homepage, which has a rather Metroid Prime-like menu design. The site also contained a blog written by someone called Mackenzie King, making several references to Samantha Manus of Channel 51. Then we got Orbis Labs, which claimed to be a company developing a sort of battle sphere, describing it as a self-contained armored machine, which was obviously a reference to the Morph Ball. Neat part is that they supposedly had a prototype design of it here too. And lastly is the Luminoth Temple form, which by the name alone is obviously referring to the Luminoth Temple of the game. It only allowed those who were 17 and over to join, and had over 2,000 users. It also required a login to use the forms, but to get the login required one to look at the so-called Samantha Mantis' last post for clues, a fake job posting on Monster.com with said clues, and also simply given to those who registered Metroid Prime 2 on the Nintendo website. Afterwards, when logging in, it would reveal itself as a Nintendo website where one would get new information for games including Geist, Killer 7, and new Metroid games. Then after, it asked you to make a username, and then you were able to explore the forums and talk with others. While this was all inspired by Halo 2's marketing in order to fight Halo 2 itself, they also had a crazy amount of other websites that were similarly named to Halo 2's I Love Bees website, with each site having a picture of Samus and a caption reading, "All your bees are belong to us. Never send a man to do a woman's job." Obviously a combination of an old famous meme, plus Halo 2's I Love Bees site, and at the same time taking a jab at Master Chief in comparison to Samus. Of course, the media quickly took notice of this campaign, and thus it had done its job to an extent with how widespread this was going. With viral marketing and being a true sequel that was being made on par with the original game's success, Metroid Prime 2 was released on November 15, 2004. Did the viral marketing work? Unfortunately, it didn't. Metroid Prime 2 was utterly crushed. In November 2002, the original Metroid Prime had done well enough to land in second place, just after Grand Theft Auto Vice City, while Metroid Prime 2 was all the way in 9th place in November of 2004. Far behind Halo 2 and Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, and only a touch north of Dragon Ball Z Budokai 3. So what happened? Was the game just not as good as the first one? Well, no, as it was a critical hit once more, with scores of 9s and 10s across the board, and with the complaints mainly just being about the difficulty, while praising the story, environments, and length of the game. What had happened was obviously that it released at that unfortunate time with two mega hitters, and no matter how creative the marketing team got, and how much buzz they generated, they just couldn't compete. This combined with the GameCube at that point especially losing steam, and even starting to fall behind the newbie Xbox in the market. Thus, it was released on what was a console that was starting to die out. While the game didn't meet commercial success, it was a critical success, and truly held its own as not just being another failed sequel to a massively popular original game like so many others have prior. And with Nintendo's next console, the Wii, just being around the corner and expected to sell very high numbers, Metroid Prime 2's sales and success was good enough for Nintendo to greenlight making a third and final game in this trilogy. With the trilogy on its path to completion, the hype around the Metroid Prime series was strong, but not just for Metroid Prime 3, but also the new dual-screen handheld known as the Nintendo DS. The producer of the Metroid Prime series, Kensuke Tanabe, developed an idea for a Metroid Prime game for this very platform that would greatly take advantage of its hardware, from its 3D graphics to its touchscreen mechanics. However, with Retro Studios already hard at work on Metroid Prime 2 and soon Metroid Prime 3, the Golden, Texas-based team couldn't afford to spend time on this handheld Prime game as well. As such, Tanabe, wanting to further influence the series with a more Western presentation, style, and ideals, contacted Nintendo's other Western studio, Nintendo Software Technology, or NST for short, to produce the Nintendo DS's killer app, Metroid Prime Hunters. The new developers of Metroid Prime Hunters, NST, already had a resume of Nintendo games they had worked on prior, and even worked on Ridge Racer DS just prior. Therefore, being experienced with the handheld and a Nintendo Western studio, Tanabe saw promise in them developing this game. Working together with NST, Tanabe and the team came up with a story that would be a midquel that would take place in between Metroid Prime 1 and 2, with Samus having her suit from Metroid Prime 2, but the gunship from Metroid Prime 1 to show a transition. But one major feature Tanabe wanted was an expansion to the Metroid Prime 2 multiplayer, which was presented as more of a bonus, but wanted to greatly expand upon it while still preserving the strong single-player mode. Therefore, the obvious inclusion of additional bounty hunters came into play. The idea of both a robust multiplayer mode and several bounty hunters was already an idea the series considered for the scrapped pitch of Metroid Prime 2. Being a producer for that game, this inspiration may have very well even stemmed from that scrapped pitch. In fact, the inclusion of bounty hunters may have not just even been for on-foot combat between them, but even dogfights with their respective gunships as seen in this concept art. Note that despite Retro Studios being rather busy, concept art such as these were still drawn up by them to get the style and look of the game to stay consistent with the rest of the 3D series. One of which is this one depicting a battle between gunships with Samus blowing up someone's gunship. Considering the fact that the game even has Samus hopping between many worlds, it's possible this mode could have also been used as an interlude while traveling between the planets, much as how one uses a gummy ship in Kingdom Hearts when going between worlds. In fact, the bounty hunters were also supposed to each have their own entrance themes. Normally, when you encounter them in-game, they would have cutscenes that play to introduce them. It is possible these would have played over it. Have a listen. The game was being developed in the early days of the Nintendo DS, thus development kits weren't finalized, and many developers had to readjust launch or close to launch games to match these final specifications. Metroid Prime Hunters was one of these games in fact. For one, the bounty hunters all had models made at a much higher polygon count and higher res textures too, each one at around a 500 polygon count. Clearly not as high as the one from the GameCube games, but had to be downscaled just to function properly on the DS. But on top of that, each bounty hunter had much smoother animations too that had to be cut down to keep the DS's processing power at a stable rate. Thus, we instead got these much choppier animations in exchange. But it's not even limited to bounty hunters, but even several environments that, while looking rather similar to the final game, feature full anti-aliasing with textures blended. Something the final Nintendo DS couldn't do. While a number of ideas were being tossed around, some altered designs and cut enemies did come into the mix as usual. The first of which is this enemy that looks straight out of Half-Life, which is fitting with the additional push of Western ideals. Likely would have been stuck and hit on the ceiling, and then would have jumped down and attacked Samus. I imagine its mouth would have been a major weak point. Found within the data of the game exist different textures for the mini-boss Guardian. Being normally a rather plain-looking droid-like villain, the three that you faced each had additional textures. The first one had 4 other textures that looked to each represent an element: ice, electro, magma, and neutral tone. The second and third each having one additional one, being an even earlier texture of electro and magma. This all may indicate that the Guardians were supposed to use elemental weapons, but were dropped during development. And found within the demo of the game called First Hunt are early versions of the Jump Pad Ray and War Wasp. The Ray being more of a dull tone, while the Wasp being a whole other model and color scheme too. The main antagonist of the game, Gorilla, had the beta design too. This one having a more realistic design to it with a rustic look. On top of that, an unused model of Gorilla opening and closing its guns exists too, but it's detached from the rest of its body. And of course, a really weird kind of Metroid referred to as a Temroid is in the data too, looking like a bushy Metroid. Now there are also regular Metroids, Zoomers, and also an enemy called the Xenomorph that was only in the First Hunt demo, but we'll return to that topic shortly. Meanwhile, single-player mode had a few unused content. As we know, doors in Metroid may be color-coded to open with a specific beam or missile. Hunters was no different, but this time, there was a different door design too for certain beams, a thin and regular door. Regular door colors exist for every beam except the shock coil and the battle hammer, while the thin door color exists only for the battle hammer and one where any beam would work on it. However, the data has a full set of 8 colors per door, corresponding to each of the 8 beams, but many of which simply go unused and sit in the data. On top of that, a number of cut objects that were to appear in maps were found in the data, including moving blocks, an unused electrical field, static models of the enemy Psycho Bit and Voltrum with and without their gun, and a number of objects corresponding to environmental designs of many different areas, including a plain generic set too, from scanners, switches, jump pads, and just static background decoration. There is also an early version of the brain chamber found in the Vito area. The demo for the game also had doors that much more resembled the ones found in Metroid Prime. And for good measure, there's even an object for obtaining the bomb, which goes unused as Samus starts out with it from the get-go. As development ran, soon came E3 2004, an E3 that was considered a massive hit for Nintendo for premiering everything from the Nintendo DS, The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, Reggie himself, Metroid Prime 2, and of course, Metroid Prime Hunters itself. Metroid Prime Hunters took the spotlight for DS games by showcasing how capable the Nintendo DS was in handling a game that looked and played so similarly to the GameCube Metroid Prime games, even winning IGN's Best Nintendo DS Game of the Show award. With the game looking like the Nintendo DS's killer app, the Nintendo DS released on November 21st, 2004, packed with a demo of the game, titled as Metroid Prime Hunters First Hunt. It was essentially an updated version of the E3 build that included 3 short single-player modes, a trailer, and a multiplayer section. The single-player mode included one called the Regulator, which was a timed race to the end of the level where Samus even fought enemies including Metroids, Metroid look-alike enemies called Xenomorphs, and Zoomers, all of which never made it into the final game, but it's hard to say if they were just intended for a demo here, which is why I can't say if these are considered cut enemies. And it ends with Samus facing off against a green clone of herself to a remix of the Metorid theme. The next mode is called Survivor. As the name states, it's a survival mode where Samus fights the 3 same normal enemies again and again in an endless wave until she dies. And the last mode being Morph Ball, where one is required to guide Samus as a Morph Ball through tunnels and collect blue energy capsules. And this demo card itself contained a number of early features, including a different take on several of Samus's weapons and abilities. The Power Beam was a lot stronger for one, being the strength of the Charge Beam in this case. However, it originally was going to have limited ammo, a first for the series if this was done, as Metroid Prime 2 only had that for only the other beam weapons, while the Power Beam still didn't need ammo. However, instead of just running out, Samus would just shoot at a slower pace until she got more ammo. But as we know, all of the other weapons in the game do have limited ammo, including the missiles. But in the demo, the missiles shared ammunition with the other weapons instead of having their own set. Now a truly unused weapon is the Electro Lob. Fully functional and is a cross between the Volt Driver and the Battle Hammer weapons from the final game, firing in an arc like the Battle Hammer while scrambling the vision of the opponents like the Volt Driver. However, both the missiles and the Electro Lob can be upgraded here by simply grabbing 2 expansion packs in order for them to become the charged varieties. The charged missiles will do massive damage, but at a cost of 15 universal ammo. The charged Electro Lob doesn't cause more damage, but can now shoot in a straight line instead of an arc, at the cost of 10 universal ammo. Now bombs are slightly different, as you can only lay 3 at a time and have to wait a short period before laying 3 more. Also, they were a lot weaker in this version before they were buffed for the retail version. And of course, there is also a double damage power-up in single player mode, while they only appeared in the multiplayer mode of the final game. And this demo was loved by those who played it on their fresh new handheld and got a taste of both the features of the system and what this game can offer once released. Game Radar even stated that it's a fine showcase for demonstrating what the Nintendo DS hardware is capable of. However, rolling to E3 2005, the game was revealed not to have online play despite the Nintendo DS having online capabilities. It received negative feedback this time, as online play was considered essential for multiplayer modes of shooting games at this point, and not having it was just not the norm anymore. Producer Tanabe, however, did state that because of the timing of the game's release, they just simply didn't have time to build the infrastructure to make the online play work. And so, after much negative feedback, in August 2005, Nintendo announced that they would delay the game in order to make online multiplayer a reality. And so, the major focus on multiplayer and specifically online play became apparent as focus shifted from single player to multiplayer. However, single player still received polish too, including its frame rate and its graphics, such as the addition of reflections on the morph ball. Multiplayer overall was being designed to take advantage of the DS's capabilities, including the handheld color palette and what would look best on its screens. As well, for a number of the levels, they were designed with a dual purpose, with many originally designed for multiplayer, but also being used in single player, and vice versa too. But speaking of those maps, the final game's data shows the evolution of some of these multiplayer maps, as 6 earlier versions of the multiplayer maps were discovered in the data. These were very unfinished in these old states. All of them lacked a lot of environmental textures and details that would give them their uniqueness. As well, there were no objects in any of them to even be properly navigated through, let alone the shape of some of these levels weren't complete either. However, the level headshot even had an additional cut map found within the game's demo that looked even more bare with just a few circular platforms around. With the game nearing release, marketing was a key, of course. Rather than going the viral marketing route that they did with Metroid Prime 2, this time they hired director Len Wiseman of the Underworld series to make an eye-catching commercial featuring a gravedigger burying bounty hunters in a futuristic setting, giving a look at how high the kill count would be in the game. Meanwhile, in Europe, a tournament was being held for the game and a show of its robust multiplayer mode as a partnership between Nintendo and HMV, with the winner being given an all-expense paid trip to meet the developers of the game at NST in Seattle. Granted, this tournament was set after the game released. But with that, the game was released on March 20th, 2006. While the series was considered rather niche then, it sold over 410,000 units in North America, which would be less than Metroid Prime 2's, but it was also on a handheld still early in its life, featuring a genre not so popular on said handheld either. But otherwise, it was another critical success for this series, even though it wasn't done by Retro Studios. However, the scores were mostly 8s and 9s rather than the 9s and 10s like the first two. The reason for this docking in points came down to 2 reasons. The first being that the controls were cramp-inducing and had a high learning curve. Made sense as it was a handheld trying to emulate a first-person shooter. But the major complaint came down to how the single-player mode was rather lacking next to the first 2 games, as levels were contrived and predictable, and too formulaic with repeated boss fights. While a real reason wasn't given as to why the single-player mode was lacking, it is believed that it is because the team focused much more on the multiplayer mode, which was considered rather stellar, and the online mode was even considered as a smooth experience. And while most agreed it was a strong addition to the series, it even won numerous awards, including the Editor's Choice Award and Best DS Game of 2006 by IGN. And while this kept Metroid fans busy with hours of fun single-player action and stellar online play with friends and the world, the trilogy was boiling down to its grand finale over at Retro Studios, with Nintendo's new console, the Wii, on the horizon. Found within the portfolio of the NST former concept artist Nick Kondo are 4 different pieces of concept art for what appears to be a Toon Metroid game. NST is well known for being the company that worked on Metroid Prime Hunters, but it appears that they wished to make a stylized Metroid game with a more cartoony style, much as how Zelda had done just a few years back. This consisted of 3 rather different looking space pirates, all of which were based on the Prime versions, and this one that looked like a very mutated version of Samus. Was the idea that Samus would be possessed by an odd alien in this concept? But alas, it's possible after completing Hunters, NST wished to make more Metroid games and pitched this, but was never accepted. A very odd art style for a realistic looking sci-fi game like this, but would have been an interesting experiment if done. After Metroid Prime 2's development finished, the team didn't have any initial plans to start the final entry of the series. Many were interested in taking on another Nintendo series, such as reviving Donkey Kong Country, or even making a Zelda spin-off featuring the last Sheikah. However, then president of Nintendo, Satoru Iwata, asked them to finish off the Prime Trilogy before they start working on other games. But the biggest challenge Iwata presented to them was to make the game take advantage of the Wii's abilities. This would mean the motion controls. With development being rather early, the Wii Remote became Retro Studios' main worry. As the game's director Mark Piscini mentioned, the game had too many functions for the amount of buttons. Prime 1 and 2 utilized an additional stick, and at least 4 more buttons than what the Wii Remote and Nunchuck had to offer. Therefore, it was time to innovate. And so soon rolled the Tokyo Game Show in 2005, where Nintendo revealed the Wii Remote to the public for the first time. The presentation was behind closed doors, and many small demos were shown to show off the Wii Remote's motion controls being put to good use. However, what was a surprise was the appearance of a Metroid Prime demo. The demo shown was the opening segment of Metroid Prime 2, but now retooled to use the Wii Remote and Nunchuck. The analog stick was simply to move around. The new feature now was the ability to freely aim with the Wii Remote, as opposed to in previous games that required you to hold the button down. As Mark McDonald of OneUp.com mentioned, it wasn't bug tested or polished, so every so often the view would spaz out for a couple of seconds, but it was enough to get me excited. While needing work, the primary controls had a proper direction now. Concurrently, Retro Studios was working on the game's concept. The idea they had in mind this time was a very different kind of Metroid game, where it would be more of an open world game, without a linear path for Samus to take and a hub world she'd return to after finishing each mission. Bounty hunting would also be explored upon more, where Samus would take these on as side quests and arrest criminals for rewards that she can use to upgrade her abilities and her gunship, to which her ship could even be used in greater capacity, such as in combination with Samus in battle. When the idea was presented to Nintendo, it was rejected, as Nintendo's understanding of the word bounty was different to how Retro Studios understood it. Nintendo instead perceived Samus as someone who completes missions out of the goodness of her heart, rather than to collect bounties. This, combined with how open world ideas were too much for the Wii's power, meant that the team had to go back to the drawing board. While the old idea was rejected, it had very minimal inclusion of Dark Samus, the main villain of the trilogy, and so the team returned to follow up the second game in delivering a solid single-player experience with a plot revolving around closure in what is an epic struggle. And considering this is the closure of what is the Metroid Prime series, this meant bringing closure to the main villain, Metroid Prime, or better known now as Dark Samus. And Dark Samus was originally set to be even further evolving. As of the end of Metroid Prime 2, we saw Dark Samus, who had already evolved from Metroid Prime after taking in the Phazon suit, evolve even further with the amount of Phazon she took in as she started to appear translucent. This trend was to continue into Metroid Prime 3, with Dark Samus set to have 5 additional forms it would go through as the game went on, from its skull starting to protrude, its heart pumping out, spiked shoulders, and just looking more and more corrupt and grotesque as it took in Phazon. Potentially the title of Corruption may have referred to this much more originally in fact, or even both of them in a sort of duality. But Samus' own corruption wasn't even considered for gameplay purposes originally. The corruption refers to the lasting effects Phazon had on Samus as the game went on, while trying to keep it under control with the PED suit and the hyper mode ability that came with it. Originally, it may have been laid out that Samus' regular Varia suit gets severely damaged as seen in this unused concept art after that battle with Dark Samus and Norion. Thus, the Galactic Federation may have made her this new PED suit using the remnants of her old suit. But during development, Retro Studios as usual was working closely with Japanese Nintendo Studios as well. In this case, Nintendo EAD. One suggestion they made was to have Hyper Mode become the central focus of the game, that it would add tension of making the player extremely powerful, but if reckless, it can backfire. Retro Studios wished to include the idea of Samus' corruption as a story beat, much as they were with Dark Samus. They in fact rejected Nintendo EAD's proposal at first, as they felt it would be difficult to implement without hurting the game. However, after much discussion, Retro Studios agreed to implement it as a regular feature, and so the reckless use of the suit may have played out more differently originally. Normally when initiating hyper mode, the longer you use it, the more corrupt Samus gets. You see this with her face when it reflects off the visor, and if it goes on for too long, you get a game over, as Samus literally becomes an exact clone of Dark Samus. However, that point of no return was said to appear differently originally. When Samus is in hyper mode, her suit physically changes form too as it goes on for longer. It goes on for 3 phases much as her face changes, but there appears to be a 4th stage of corruption too that was cut. This, while looking similar to Dark Samus, still looked different enough, but much as how Phazon is called a cancer in the first game, being stage 4 here may indeed have been what we were set to originally see in the game over screen in place of the Dark Samus clone. However, there are beliefs that this could have even led to a darker, more alternate ending if Samus hit that level. In this case, here is the cut potential enemy known as the MK5 prototype, a replica mech suit that the Galactic Federation made based on Samus' suit. The concept art shows them with full combat abilities at that. Either this force of mech units were to assist Samus in the fight against the space pirates, Dark Samus and others, or it is possible that this level of firepower was used by the Federation to suppress the cut stage 4 corrupt Samus, which could have led to a bad ending. A contingency plan of sorts for when they made the PED suit for Samus. All potentially orchestrated by Admiral Dane, who gives all the commands in the final game at that. Originally, however, he did also look quite different as seen in this old concept art, having a false leg, eye patch, a lightsaber, and what might be a cybernetic jaw. But in addition, there were 2 cut Galactic Federation transmissions. To summarize, these tell of how the space pirates went into a civil war once the Phazon supply had depleted, until the Phazon seed that was delivered to them by Dark Samus set them back on course. But while on the topic of enemies, a variety were considered as usual while developing the game, but ultimately cut. These include a plethora of cut space pirates, including the Advanced Pirate Militia, Advanced Shield Militia, Assault Pirate Militia, and Assault Shield Militia. These are upgraded versions of the regular and Shield Pirate Militia. The advanced versions were weak to missiles but resistant to beam attacks, and apparently these were armored pirates that received a promotion. Meanwhile, the Assault variant was resistant to missiles and of a higher ranking, and if proven worthy, would be enlisted in the official Space Pirate Army. In addition to these pirates is this cut Phasite Armored Trooper, which may in fact have been an early form of the Commando Pirate, considering how similar they look. Both are wearing armor made of phasite and have a similar color scheme, the difference here being that this is just a basic pirate trooper with this armor, unlike the final Commando Pirate. Another cut enemy are the Manthas. They would be a lot like the gliders from Metroid Prime 1, in that you would be able to grapple swing using them. Next are the Face Sprites, which have the ability to turn invisible and can generate a bright light that will short-circuit Samus' combat visor. This being a lot like the Resbit Virus, who did the same in Metroid Prime 2. Then there are the cut Phazon Tentacle, which would have followed the tradition of previous games with the Reaper Vine and Darkling Tentacle. This likely would appear on Phase A, which would have attacked with its hook of course. This being followed by another Phase A enemy known as the Salamander, which not much more is known beyond that. And lastly being the Vapor Wing, which were said to appear in Skytown, appearing as rings that would explode upon being shot. Apparently they were made pets by the inhabitants, but gone rogue. And not really an enemy, but there is also a cut species called the Endokun, which sounds very similar to the name Edokun, who are friendly aliens from Super Metroid. Their log entry even lists them as being playful. Now, in addition to regular enemies, there are bosses being planned that were eventually cut. Most prominently is Crocomire from Super Metroid, the very enemy who brutally melts in lava after being defeated. This isn't the first time he was cut from a game either, as in Metroid Zero Mission, he was set to appear as well, and with skin that wasn't so rough or burned, indicating how it was to take place before Super Metroid. Potentially this would have been the origin of Crocomire instead, and would have shown how it was scarred by Super Metroid. Based on the sketches here, this appears to be the case here too, with it having smoother skin and overall looking more agile. But yet in some other takes here, he looks more mechanical. It's possible this may have been here with the intention of either having Prime 3 originally taking place after Super Metroid, and thus having more of a meta Crocomire here, much like Metorid, or that he is simply wearing armor here. Considering he appears in hot caverns, appearing in Bryo's hot caverns may have been the intention. Another boss is one called the Pirate Prime. It is the most intimidating space pirate seen yet in the series, even more so than Omega Pirate. Considering one visits the pirate home world, it is quite possible that this was their actual leader and served as its boss too. As well, the boss fight with Gandrada was going to feature her transforming mid-fight into a Reptilicus form called the Reptilicus G, whereby she would be able to gain a cloaking shield ability, meaning you would need to use your extra visors on her at that stage. The form, of course, was simplified to her going invisible on her own in the end. Now here we have an early take of Metroid Prime 3's Metorid, which still looks a lot like the one from Metroid Prime 1, but this one has circuit boards for its wings and is a blue shade, potentially an indication of how much Phazon it has taken in. Its final name is Mecharid, as opposed to Metorid, indicating that this one may have gone even more mechanical after being further damaged by Samus. Perhaps this was who Samus was to fight at the beginning of the game when falling down the giant shaft. But there is more to Ridley, as we have another form of Ridley that was cut. This one being of a skeletal Ridley. The images originally appeared together with the Omega Ridley images, potentially meaning that this was the original form of Omega Ridley, or maybe even a second form it would have taken whereby it would stay alive in skeletal form due to the intense amount of Phazon that is sustaining it. To top it off, Omega Ridley also at one point was just to be regular Meta Ridley, as seen in this beta opening shot of the boss fight. Now, when making the opening of the game, they had a very different one in mind, whereby Samus would be fighting Kraid, a boss that was cut from Metroid Prime 1, and of course appearing in 3 previous 2D Metroids at the time. This would of course be a battle we would never experience, and would just be a cinematic here. But I wouldn't be surprised if they intended to reuse the Kraid model from Metroid Prime 1 here. But returning now to Samus herself, within the data of the game, 2 cut morphball abilities were found in the debug menu called the Fireball and the Ice Ball. While the game crashes if one tries to activate either of them, concept art does exist of them. They may have in fact been intended for Bryo, which has a mix of ice and fire areas. I can see the Fireball especially being used for sections like these that have a frozen morphball tunnel. It's possible that it being limited to one location is why it was scrapped in the end. But as mentioned earlier, Retro Studios had plans for a more open-world Metroid game that would utilize Samus' gunship potentially in battle. This was planned in the original pitch, but they had wished to implement it into the story too. This is evident by the cut ability found within the data called the Ship Grapple expansion. This may have been a hint that Samus would have called her gunship to a certain location and then grappled to its underside to cross an area, or even fly around while hanging off it. But it never made it into the final game, something the team has since regretted not being able to make work. Now, while open world concepts may have been a lost dream, a lot of plans were made for the environments of the game that never made it in, or were just outright altered. Starting off with this presumably lost planet featuring jungles and coral all over. Meanwhile, it doesn't seem to have any real Phazon pollution either, potentially one of the worlds you could have visited that wasn't contaminated yet. Now, there are some really strange environments too that were cut. The first of which are these textures found through former Retro Studio artist Ben Sprout's website. These are literally textures for rooms made of flesh, labeled as skin carpet, eye flesh, meat floor, muscle rim, and shell wall. These are stuff you'd expect more from a game like Doom rather than Metroid. The obvious idea of where these textures may have been were within the Leviathans you enter in the game. Despite being alive, the Leviathans inside look more like a Phazon cave, with limited organic parts. These textures as such may have been intended for it. In fact, we do to an extent see similar but different kinds of it used on the Scark in their Space Pirate research facility. But overall, making the whole interior look like that may have looked too grotesque and thus removed. Another one is the structure from an unknown area featuring what is a dragon head of sorts with chains holding it up. Much as in Metroid Prime 1 where an idea was dropped for looking too much like an RPG element, this one appears to have also been dropped for that very reason. Now, Brio was envisioned quite differently, with it having much more plant and fungal life as opposed to how minimal it is in the final game. As well, Brio had a number of murals that never made it into the final game that further showcased, in addition to the existing murals, the lore of the planet and how the inhabitants prophesized the coming phase-on and the fall of their civilization. As development continued, the game started to take shape, and they started to take further advantage of the Wii's capacity, such as the use of the Wii Connect 24, in order to receive friend vouchers that you can share with other friends playing the game that will land you with friend credits. These, along with other credits you receive in the game, could be used to purchase various extras such as concept art, sounds, and various other items. Top this off with how, despite the Wii not allowing for open world mechanics, it did still allow for bigger worlds, such as Skytown, which would have been very difficult to replicate on the GameCube. And with a bigger disc at hand, storage limitations weren't as big of a deal, and so full voice acting was now incorporated into the game between the Galactic Federation and the Bounty Hunters, a first for a series that had very limited voice work prior. Meanwhile, in the sound department, Scott Peterson was charged with making sounds that were mainly using highs and lows, while the mid-range was kept for weapons, music, and creatures. Meanwhile, veteran musician Kenji Yamamoto continued on with the stylized music of the previous two games. Eventually, the controls were finalized, or rather simplified compared to the last two games, featuring only one beam weapon that would gradually stack or upgrade, while the visors were mapped to the L button that would bring up a menu that would quickly let you select which you would like to use, saving on the need for a number of buttons this way. Meanwhile, motion controls were being further added, implemented for more intuitive controls, such as turning a switch or straight up ripping a shield off an opponent using the grapple beam. In fact, the shield was a new feature for the space pirates to use, and some even feel this might have been influenced by the use of the shields in Halo by the Covenant. This especially being a possibility as the team at Retro Studios was confirmed to be influenced by the Halo series at the time when making this game, and this may have further influenced the much heavier action of this game and the influence of the Galactic Federation, which was the opposite of the isolated action-adventure it normally is. By May 2007, at the media summit held by Nintendo, then president of Nintendo America, Reggie Fils-Aimé, stated that Metroid games have never played this way before, and that Nintendo's other employees have commented that it will reinvent the control scheme for a first-person shooter. This especially being an answer to many skeptics who had seen first-person controls on the Wii not perform to what they would think it would. However, as the release date of August 27, 2007 inched closer, Metroid Prime 3 was not being marketed at all. Many were quick to criticize Nintendo on this, with many believing that this may have been due to Nintendo's bigger focus on the casual market, and because of how low the sales were of Prime 2, despite its marketing. However, Nintendo did eventually release the Metroid Prime 3 preview channel on August 10, 2007, via the Wii's shop channel. This channel would feature trailers and footage of the game, including promotional artwork. Following this, they launched their next marketing campaign, the Month of Metroid, which would bring about new footage for the game, as well as the virtual console release of Metroid 1 and Super Metroid, leading up to Corruption's release date. However, critiques still stood, as this was all still limited to just Wii owners who may not even bother downloading this preview channel in the first place, let alone the general public even noticing, unlike with the usual ad campaigns on television doing the trick. But even so, the game released in North America on August 27, 2007, and despite sales not reaching the original Metroid Prime sales, it did succeed in overtaking Prime 2's sales. However, as with previous entries, it was once again a smashing critical success, scoring well into the 9s and 10s across the board, with all its aspects being praised, from its graphics, voice acting, action, puzzles, levels, and even the motion controls that were the source of worry for Retro Studios at the start of development. Some did still criticize the controls as they felt it was still a bit difficult, but overall a successful and enjoyable take at last of first-person controls on the Wii. This was truly a perfect end for a sub-series that had no bad games, a trilogy that was praised across the board, and ending on a high note amongst reviewers as well. Eventually, the trilogy was compiled together into a special metal-tinned collection called the Metroid Prime Trilogy. an item that not only ported Prime 1 and 2 to the Wii, but also even added motion controls to those games to bring them into uniform fashion. But while the story of the villain Metroid Prime and Dark Samus was over, the game's 100% ending hinted that there was still more to tell one day, with a suspicious ship of the bounty hunter Silex from Metroid Prime hunters following Samus. And as the years went by, Retro Studios eventually took a break from the series to successfully revive Donkey Kong, while Metroid returned to more of its 2D roots. However, the Prime story eventually started to return with Metroid Prime Federation Force in 2016, developed by Next Level Games, who were prior to this responsible for Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon, a game that received much controversy for its chibi art style and departure from the series after being dormant for so long, but following up on the ending of that very game was to be a build-up to the next entry, Metroid Prime 4, which was announced shortly after in 2017. Initially, a game that was to be outsourced by Nintendo, but after troubled development for 2 years, Retro Studios pitched to Nintendo their own idea for Metroid Prime 4. As a result, Retro Studios was given the key once more for making this new fourth entry that after 6 years since it restarted development, it finally saw the light of day. And thank you for watching. Hit the subscribe button for more Metroid and other games gaming history and cut content soon. Hit the like button and comment below on which was your favorite piece of history with the series. So everyone, thank you for watching.